I'm really glad to be here. I think we have a wonderful program in store tonight. And I want to start by introducing our presenter. Dr. John McCarthy is a professor emeritus in the theology department at Loyola University in Chicago, where he was the chair from 1994 to 2003, but he didn't retire until 2020. And as you'll see, he's still very active. He's a McCord Fellow at the Center for Theology Inquiry in Princeton, New Jersey, where in 2016, he was part of an inquiry into the social impact of astrobiology, sponsored by NASA and the Templeton Foundation. Currently, he's writing on public theology in the context of astrobiology and space sciences. His continuing research interests include philosophy of religion, philosophy of science, math, physical cosmology, phenomenology, hermeneutics, and philosophical theology. He has a few recent publications that are of special interest to IRAS members, and details are listed in the description for this evening's webinar. But one title in particular really struck me. The title was, "Where Have All the Heavens Gone? Galileo's Letter to the Grand Duchess Christina." So put together with tonight's title, I can't help but think this man is a master of intriguing titles. So Dr. McCarthy, while you're sharing your screen, let me remind everyone to use the Q&A button rather than the chat function, which we've disabled this evening. I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say, and go ahead and take it away.
All right, I think, thank you very much for that. And I'm assuming that everyone can hear at this point.
Yep, all good.
I hope that's the case. Okay, great. Then let's go on. And thank you very much, Maynard, for the introduction, or JD, I'm sorry. So I've chosen to kind of read this from a text because I wanted to make sure that I was careful in the presentation of this. So we'll see if this comes across, okay? In my academic career, when engaging students to write everything from undergraduate essays to PhD dissertations, I relied on two general maxims. One, writing is the process of going from a here to a there. And two, in this process, you need to tell the reader or the thinker what you're going to say it as best you can, and then remind the reader what you've said. So let me see if I can follow my own maxims here. The spoiler, the title of this presentation is, Can an Astrobiologist Use the Word God Meaningfully? And the response to my question is yes. The here to there is the process of describing what generically I'm calling a public contextual theology. And more specifically, given the current contextual demands, an astrobiological theology. My main claim is twofold. One, that I can describe to you what it might mean to think theologically in the public context of the contemporary sciences and technologies that make up astrobiological investigations. And two, that unless something like, I should be switching slides here. There we go. I have to learn how to walk and chew gum at the same time. That unless something like what I'm describing is done, any intersection between astrobiology and theology is at a greater risk of being colonized by theology than if this initial groundwork is not in place. And the here, it is the specific occasion afforded by the September 2016 to May 2017 NASA and Templeton-funded inquiry at Princeton Center of Theological Inquiry, titled The Social Impact of Astrobiology. For that inquiry, 10 scholars, most professional university-based academic theologians, were brought together for a 9-month residential research project. The inquiry was regularly informed by NASA-affiliated astrobiologists, recent shareholders of the Baruch S. Blumberg NASA Library of Congress Chair in Astrobiology Exploration and Scientific Innovation, and a host of Princeton and visiting scholars, all related in various ways to space sciences, astrophysics, biology, and literature. Each of the 10 participants submitted a competitive research proposal, and each presented at regular weekly colloquia meetings and other arranged public forums. Some entered the inquiry with a clear vision of their research project in mind, projects that brought their own theological and sometimes scientific, literary, philosophical, or historical training to bear on the intersections of astrobiology and society. For myself, what has remained consistent from the original research proposal and now are two basic features. One, a conviction that theology and astrobiology are both human thinking projects, already within a particular historical, social, linguistic, and cultural set of institutions and practices called society. And two, an abiding question of why NASA would want to assemble a group of professional academic theologians to respond to an inquiry on the social impact of astrobiology. From the beginning, I wondered why NASA did not assemble a group more directly involved with contemporary social sciences, sociology, anthropology, political science, psychology, communication, history, and the like. It seems that the Freedom from Religion Foundation not only shared my question, they weaponized this concern as a violation of the constitutional separation of church and state, arguing that if a group consisted not of theologians, but of other scholars who could objectively analyze the impact of scientific endeavors on a society that measurably included religious institutions and practices, there would be no problem. The problem was theological thinking, supported by a governmentally chartered and funded institution like NASA. For me, the aggressive stance of the Freedom from Religion Foundation helped to hone the direction of my now rather long research project. How would I best shape my own initial question about the makeup of the Princeton NASA inquiry into a here to there research project? The here, I realized, had three elements. One, a certain set of rather commonplace assumptions about theological thinking represented by the Freedom from Religion Foundation, namely that theological thinking represents particular religious traditions and institutions, that in a modern pluralistic society, theology is an advocacy position for an interest group, that it makes claims to allegiances, certainties, and faith rather than inquiry, probabilities, and reformable knowledge. Two, a somewhat risky invitation from NASA to support an interchange between astrobiology and space sciences and academic theology. And three, my own long-standing conviction that unless theological thinking could make a better case than it typically does about being public, it will go the way of phlogiston, flat earth, and physiognomy, kind of public flatulence. So over the years since 2017, my project has been moving from the three-pronged here just described to a there, which I will tentatively label astrobiological theology, in service of the project of a public contextual theology, a type of theology which I generally describe as one form of theological thinking in the context of a public project or activity, in this case, the scientific project of astrobiology and space sciences. So to reiterate, my claim that an astrobiologist can use the word God meaningfully consists of a description of astrobiological theological thinking. The argument from this claim, going from a here to there, will take 4 steps, along with an explanation of why doing this kind of public theology is indispensable to the field of academic theology itself. So step 1, I want to make some observations about theology and some of the already existing examples of the intersection of theology with astrobiology. Step 2, I want to identify 2 fundamental existential features of thinking in the context of both theology and astrobiology. 3, some further specification of how I see theology, or the theos of this thinking, to be specifically public and meaningful. And step 4, some brief comments on what I would suggest are examples of the topics important for this form of public contextual theological thinking. Okay, so there I've told you what I'm going to do. My job is to do this. Your job is to expand, disagree, agree, clarify, or otherwise critically engage. So step 1. Observations about theology and some of the already existing examples of the intersection of theology with astrobiology. Recognizing that the practice of astrobiology as a scientific technological project is a rather recent 20th and 21st century phenomenon directed broadly to a knowledge product about the origin, possibility, actuality, extent, and future of life and habitability in what we currently call the universe, most theological authors avert a long history of relating theos to both all that is and within that to life, especially human life. This appeal to a long established in life as a warrant for continued engagement, now with astrobiology, is typically augmented by 3 other claims. One dealing in some way with a religious dimension to the common feeling of wondrous scale and looking up at the sky. One dealing with the potential effect of astrobiology on interpreting traditional religious traditions. And the other, that the practice and potential success of the science and technology of astrobiology has some clearly envisioned ethical issues for life on Earth and elsewhere. Insofar as theological thinking has traditionally experiential, doctrinal, and ethical dimensions, then again, there is a warrant for the continued theological engagement with astrobiology. Theology itself has regularly been described as a field-encompassing field of thought, which is to say that it includes philosophy, history, linguistics, hermeneutics, pragmatics, aesthetics, ethics, sociology, natural and biological sciences, literature, scripture study, to name a few of the fields of thinking. Its expression in the various genres that present theological thinking: historical theology, scripture studies, systematic theology, philosophical theology, cultural theology, on, and notably for our purposes, astrotheology, just to name a few of the genres within theology. Typically, in the practice of theological thinking, these genre boundaries are rather porous. For example, scripture study, systematic concerns with doctrines like creation, incarnation, and providence, concerns with moral practice, and the aesthetics of wonder about the cosmos can come together in various iterations of the intersection of theology with astrobiology. Ted Peters identifies astrotheology as a form of public theology, which he formally describes as thinking, quote, conceived in the church, reflected on critically in the academy, and addressed to the world for the sake of the world, end quote. Where a religious tradition, critically, conceptually, constructively, responds, in this case, to the stimulus presented by the practice of astrobiology. With varying nuances, I think the theological thought intersecting with astrobiological sciences and the work of Ted Peters, Andrew Davidson, Oli Picaviano, Eric Pearson, Andreas Loesch, Adam Pryor, John Mix, and a whole host of others could all find some resonance with Ted Peters' broad description of astrotheology. And I agree, this broadly hermeneutical concern with interpreting, in this case, Christian symbols, creation, salvation, Genesis, image of God, covenant, in the context of astrobiological sciences, is likely the most typical current way of envisioning the intersection of theology and astrobiology, a religious tradition bringing its long history of thought to bear on a contemporary reality. I don't want to disparage or criticize this formal structure of theological thinking. Indeed, I think the case can be made and has been made, for example, by the work of the University of Chicago-based theologian David Tracy, that this formal structure is arguably public thinking. My path here is not a critical one, but rather one that, to use a term from phenomenological philosophy, brackets or sets aside for the moment this way of doing theological thinking in order to let another form of theological thinking show itself. One which I will argue appropriately, one, begins with astrobiology rather than within the church, as Ted Peters describes. Two, is arguably theological, and three, uses seemingly unfamiliar concepts to make a different kind of claim to being public. So, to recall the freedom from religion kerfuffle, along with my own question about the population gathered for the NASA CTI inquiry, have led me to question both the limited scope of the Freedom from Religion Foundation understanding of theology, and what I see to be the rather conventional assumption that theological thinking is best understood as a hermeneutical enterprise at the intersection of culturally religious symbols in a contemporary world. With these few remarks to explain my initial bracketing of this form of hermeneutical theology, let me then go to the second step, an identification of two fundamental existential features of thinking in the context of both theology and astrobiology. Step two, in this context, thinking feature number one might be stated in the following way. At an everyday level of experience, we live our lives terrestrially, but we can think our lives and life extraterrestrially in many ways. Recognizing the terrestrial, as well as many of the words in this statement, everyday, experience, life, think, admit of a wide range of uses and thus create certain kinds of problems for projects that mix disciplines. By terrestrial, I'm referring to an existential phenomenological claim that we as humans live in a situation of Earth's gravitational priority in a relatively thin atmospheric blanket with a multi-billion year history undergoing various localized geobiochemical and physical interactions and supporting a habitat that allows for a variety of forms of cultural conditioning. And by thinking our lives and life extraterrestrially in many ways, I'm referring to forms of thinking, imagination, religion, dreams, play, travel, skywatching, literature, technologies, arts, sciences, philosophies, that modify or suspend one or more of these terrestrial situational constraints in order to understand our lives and life differently. Thinking feature number two, attentive consciousness recognizes a distinction that's stated simply between there is and we are. My claim about attentive consciousness, a conviction that matches and is best understood by the phenomenological stance that I'm taking, thus does not entertain either a radical idealism or a radical positivistic naturalism as the most adequate description of the activity of human consciousness. Calling attention to what I am claiming is a recognizable feature of human thinking can and has generated a wide variety of philosophical, psychological, and sociological clarifications, which we can explore. But for now, I'm putting this and the previous thinking feature forward as existential phenomenological realities, identifiable in both theological and astrobiological thinking. Thinking feature number 2 is a descriptive statement about human consciousness. It's not a deductive statement or a tautological necessity. Rather, its truth lies in shared recognition. I consciously attend to this distinction. It becomes true and meaningful if my description successfully draws your attention to this distinction between there is and we are. Why invoke these kinds of claims about thinking features shared by theological and astrobiological thinking? For 2 reasons. 1, the claim locates the existential place of astrobiology and theology in what I am contending are the formal features of human conscious thinking. That, for lack of a better word, gives the impetus to thinking, theologically and astrobiologically. Both astrobiology and theology as thinking enterprises take place in a shared gap between the it is and we are, between terrestrially conditioned thinking and the suspension of some of the normal conditions of that thinking. That is where thinking God happens, both theologically and astrobiologically. Whatever else God might be for an activity of human thought, an ontological reality, a person, a good beyond good, Trinity, love, creator, object of worship, I am contending God is a placeholder in this gap between it is and we are, between what occasions intuition and the exercise of intuition, our everyday practical thinking and the suspension of some of the many conditions that establish that thinking. In this sense, and for the purpose of investigating the intersection of theology and astrobiology as a project describing an astrobiological theology, God is first and foremost a place rather than a name, a place in language for human thinking. The second reason I am invoking these claims about the features of thinking, they locate the intersections between you and I in this webinar. Let's linger for a moment with this because it's more than a theoretical claim and more than a claim to be true in the way in which scientific observation is true, although it's also both of these. This claim is methodologically crucial. Without basic agreement between you and I about this claim regarding features of thinking, that we live our lives terrestrially, but that we can think our lives and life extraterrestrially in many ways, and that there is an intelligible distinction to be made between there is and we are, any further claims that might follow in this presentation will be at best pleasantly idiosyncratic. The common ground methodologically between you and for what I want to present as a response to the question I've set for this webinar, can an astrobiologist use the word God meaningfully, are these claims that I'm labeling existential and phenomenological, the way we as human beings live our lives and what energizes certain forms of conscious thought about living our lives. Again, methodologically, these 2 basic claims about features of human thinking are important because they're obviously vague and imprecise. And thus, methodologically, what follows goes under the banner of making more precise. And two, making more precise in this phenomenological claim is less a process of logical deduction and norms of validity than it is a process of data-informed description presented as shared communicative activity between us. If my contention that an astrobiologist can speak meaningfully about God is at least intelligible, if not also true and important, it will rest on shared agreement that both astrobiology and theology are forms of human thinking, and that my two claims about the features of this thinking draw attention correctly to what energizes this thinking, a gap, a potential nothingness that is the place of thinking. So step 3. Under the banner of making my two previous claims about thinking a bit more precise, what is the theos of this thinking, shared by theology and astrobiology? And how might I describe this theos thinking, this theology, as public and meaningful? Amidst a welter of short definitions or descriptions of theology that you can find in the history of theology, in my case, Christian theology, let me suggest a formulation that I propose is appropriate for the situation determined by the intersection of theology and astrobiology. Theology is human thinking that responds to the relational gap between the there is and we are by offering language for understanding this relational gap in both a thought encompassing and humanly compelling form. Often, I would suggest, theological language uses the word God and the symbols associated with God in its proffered understanding of this relational gap. But I am contending the use of the word God and the associated symbols do not constitute either a necessary or a sufficient condition for theological thinking. That condition is better met by whatever language responds to the triple exigency of understanding this relational gap in a thought encompassing and humanly compelling form. Functionally, I'm offering this formulation about theological thinking for several reasons. One, it locates theology as a human thinking enterprise. Two, it offers the possibility that other genres of thought, literature, philosophy, the sciences, ethics, politics, and yes, astrobiology, may be doing theology. Three, it challenges both more conventional locations for theological thinking, as well as other genres of thought to become more articulate about the fundamental structures of consciousness that energize their more historically and professionally defined fields of interest. Four, it suggests a paradigm other than stimulus response, beginning in a religious treatise between astrobiology and theology. And five, it encourages traditional theological thinking to appreciate its language, tradition, and symbols less as some sort of privileged revelation and more as one revealing entry point into the work of a living understanding of life. It's not difficult to recognize the projects involved in astrobiological sciences and technologies as both public and meaningful. There are certainly ways to specify both what is meant by public and meaningful here. This would be done, I think, by describing what is involved in open, shared educational programs leading to professional scientific practice, in structures of peer review, in the sources of funding, governmental and corporate, that support astrobiology, in the easily demonstrated public non-professional interest in the topics engaged by astrobiology, in the shared standards for meaningful communication among astrobiological research groups, In these and many ways, it's not difficult to make the case that astrobiology, as a currently exercised scientific practice in a social context, is both public and meaningful. It's less obvious to make the case that it's theological thinking itself, and not only a stimulus to a kind of thinking, theology, that is fundamentally different. And this was the freedom from religion's foundation problem. To conceive theological thinking as likewise public and meaningful, rather than an apology for institutional advocacy masquerading as public, meaningful, even true. It's obviously the case that God language plays absolutely no functional role in the science of astrobiology, and for good reasons. It is clear why such language and symbols ought not to play any functional scientific role in the biological, chemical, astrophysical, planetary, geological, and atmospheric sciences that constitute astrobiology's search for the origin, presence, extent, and future of conditions for habitability. But astrobiology, as one among many forms of potential theological thinking, is, I'm arguing, neither a silly speculation from a colonizing discipline, theology, nor is it inherently involved with religion, advocacy, and privateness, and the like, as the free foundation for freedom from religion constructs theological thinking. Astrobiology is comfortable understanding itself as an amalgamation of scientific practices dealing with habitability in regional and cosmic scales. It's not comfortable being understood as theological, largely, I would contend, because theological thinking has itself been colonized by the rather recent invention of the modern category of religion, rather than understanding itself as a form of thinking within one exercise of human consciousness. To reiterate, I'm not trying to reduce the reference of theological thinking to the latest results of cognitive science or psychology or neurochemistry. Nor am I arguing that the understanding of theological thinking should not include more standard practices of a hermeneutics of tradition. What I am, however, saying that when an astrobiologist offers language for the energy of engaging in an understanding of the relational gap between it is and we are, between terrestrial thinking and the suspension of some of its conditions, in a way that is both thought encompassing, thought that includes all the sciences and technologies involved, as well as the social locations of those sciences and technologies, and offers itself as humanly compelling, then it's engaged in theological thinking, whether it uses the word God or not. I especially want to note two things here. One, unless astrobiology ultimately understands itself as a thought enterprise about life and habitability that is wholly contained by the rigorous sciences recognized as physics, chemistry, biology, astrophysics, and the like, then it must, at some point, within astrobiological thinking itself, consider what gives life to its thought about life. And this, I contend, is astrobiological theology. Two, unless this inter-astrobiological thinking is articulated, then the interchange between astrobiology and contemporary professional academic theology, like that supported by NASA, Templeton, and CTI, will veer, despite good intentions, to a potential displacement of its own inner theological life force by a somewhat benevolent, sometimes not so benevolent, colonizing theological enterprise. In the interchange, astrobiological thinking will be speaking another language given to it as response, as language authorized by professional licensing rather than its own, now halted, now underdeveloped, indigenous voice. Step 4, a fourth and final step then. Some brief comments on what I would suggest are topics for this form of public contextual theological thinking that might augment the larger social understanding and engagement with astrobiology beyond ethics and doctrinal hermeneutics, while simultaneously maintaining the overwhelmingly definitive exercise of astrobiology as a modern science. While I do think that an astrobiologist could use the word God meaningfully, I surely both understand why the word shows up with minuscule frequency in word counts when the 3 major scientific journals of astrobiology are indexed, and would not think or expect or suggest that this should change. If change should come, it should come more in the practices and educational preparations for conventional professional theology, and possibly in an expansion of the engagement within the practice of astrobiology of its already current forms of social interfacing. But briefly, to the topics that an astrobiologist might explore doing astrobiological theology. The topics that you often find in Christian theological thinking include God, of course, as well as Trinity, faith, creation, church, Bible, Jesus, salvation, incarnation, and the like. These Christian theological topics are not going to be part of astrobiological theological topics in any readily translatable way. Nor I think should be. Let me just suggest, and I can do no more than that here, 3 topics that I think might be examples: alien, measure, and attention. Briefly then, the alien. At a popular level, aliens have dominated the science fictions associated with extra life forms. Phenomenological philosophy has taken on for some time now as an important category in human consciousness, the alien within human consciousness, the uncanny, dreams, the and pre-conscious, alternative social constructions of consciousness and normalcy, and the alien outside human conscious control, the unexpected, the horrible, the unintended, the provocative. Astrobiology is used to dealing with the unexpected, the provocative, alternative constructions of normalcy, with extremophiles and exoplanets, with methane rather than water, with search without finding. In short, with the practice of listening to the it is as we are, with the expectation that it is likely alien, not quite like us, somewhere in the gap between the terrestrial and its suspension. This is belief in astrobiology, and one of the facets of that belief is belief in the possibility of the alien, a belief that entails another topic, measure. Measure is profound human activity involving everything from the quantification of physical, chemical, and biochemical entities to the social measurements of normalcy, legality, beauty, and morality. The alien is revealed in systems of measurement as somehow confounding measurement, displacing systems of measurement, demanding new and different measurement. The it is, in this sense, a no thing, a nothing, that which is either beyond a measurement or is the measure of all measures. The potential radicality of the same time luring it to suspend certain conditions of the terrestrial is at home in the energy, dare I say, spirit of astrobiology. And entailed by both the alien and measure is some consideration of a phenomenology of attention, of that which exceeds the more willful control of intention by allowing consciousness to be surprised, to be shocked, to be horrified, to have to think it all through again, because now what was not intended has forced itself to attention. Again, the gap between the it is and the we are is entered, not primarily because of conviction, convention, or consolation, but because it must be attended to, even if other conditions of consciousness need to be suspended. It is, I would suggest, that topics like these that emerge when the distinction between the it is and we are, the terrestrial and its suspension, the intended and the attended to, the gap that gives rise to a certain practice of non-reiterative thought. These are the fledgling topics for astrobiology. They are not in any immediate way the topics of conventional Christian academic theology. It remains, I would suggest, to see whether there may be some family resemblances among these theologies. But unless astrobiology allows for and is allowed to speak its own theological voice, it will not enter a genuine theological dialogue, no matter how generous the invitations may be. If anything I have said in these reflections makes sense in responding positively to the question, can an astrobiologist use the word God meaningfully, with some indication of what astrobiological theology might involve, I'm now fulfilling my maxim of reminding you of where I have been with my claim. It suffers miserably from being underdeveloped, still in pitiful need of more precision. But let me end, despite all this, with an image, one where I intentionally lift the brackets that I impose on logical thinking by invoking the story of the prodigal son. It's celebrated as a story of joyful return, abundant understanding, and forgiveness. The prodigal returns home. The one who squandered his inheritance on a debaucherous journey outside the household now returns, penitent and accepted. Well, not totally. What I'm envisioning as a theological enterprise is a certain prodigality, going out of the household, being surprised, being roughed up, living in the unanticipated and unprepared for, and then a return, not to forgiveness and a fatted terrestrial calf, but rather to a new conversation, with a conversation not so much of relief over wrongdoing, but rather one that lives from phrases like, do you know what I saw? I was shocked by. Can I introduce you to? What do we do now? Isn't this part of the spirit of astrobiology, and thus an image of astrobiological theology?
Thank you very much, Dr. McCarthy. That was very interesting. Let me introduce our respondent. You can stay muted. Technical difficulties always unnerve me, but I think we're on a good track. So our respondent this evening is Dr. Robert Boyle. He's an astronomer at Dickinson College. He did his undergraduate work in astrophysical science at Princeton and then went to Yale for his master's and doctorate in astronomy. His research involves the chemical compositions of celestial bodies, with his primary interest varying between stars, galaxies, and planets over his long career, long enough that he sometimes describes himself as Dickinson Astronomy Department's old geezer. Incidentally, and of interest to the many IRAS members following artificial intelligence, when I Googled Dr. Boyle, Google's AI helpfully added the following to his resume, unprompted. Quote, Dr. Boyle is also considered the father of chemistry, having discovered the relationship between volume and pressure in gases, a relationship known as Boyle's law, end quote. So there's that too. And, if Dr. Boyle wants to claim it. Otherwise, let's call it a cautionary note for anyone that's tempted to become dependent on AI for their basic information. And I am seeing some laughing emojis from our audience. So with that, I'm going to let you, Dr. Boyle, give your response.
I can't claim all of chemistry. Maybe a little tiny bit here and there, but certainly not all of chemistry. Well, gosh, I'm uh, uh, I'm not an astrobiologist. I should say that's one area of astronomy I haven't dealt with. I'm merely an astrophysicist, although I've dabbled with a lot of things. I happen to be a believer, but I could not count myself as even an amateur theologian. Um, and when I saw the question initially, my immediate response to a truncated version, with the last word dropped out, was, "Oh yeah, sure, they can use the word God, but they don't have to, of course." Um, but then, of course, the key thing is meaningful, right? And that's where um, my either lack of expertise or particular unusual expertise may come to be of some help. Um, I do a lot of thinking about what science is and what we do in science, and that's what sort of prompts my response. I love the little parable that comes out of the beginning of Saint-Exupéry's book Le Petit Prince, um, where he's being asked by this mysterious young prince to draw a sheep. "Please, sir, draw me a sheep," and he tosses off several, none of which meet the little prince's satisfaction. And then finally, he draws a box, and he throws this to the prince and says, "This is only the box. The sheep you want is inside." And as Saint-Exupéry says, the little prince looks and says, "Oh, this is precisely the kind of sheep I wanted." And I believe, what science does is what Saint-Exupéry did. We draw the box, and we don't even bother really about what's inside. There may be something inside. So, why does my pen drop? Well, it drops because of gravity. Well, why is gravity there? Well, because of the curvature of space-time. Why is the curvature of space-time? Well, nobody has a really good answer, but someone will have some different answer at some point in the future, and they'll just be building the box again, smaller and smaller inside. And what we do is we create these falsifiable structures that we can test, and that's what we call science. So I guess my question to Dr. McCarthy is, can there be a falsifiable theology? I expect I know the answer. I think astrobiologists would like to think that astrobiology is a science and therefore is falsifiable. But can there be a falsifiable theology, and can there be a falsifiable astrobiological theology? Is your special type of theological thinking in any sense testable? And if not, how does it fall in terms of where science sits and where theology sits?
Good. I appreciate the question. Thank you very much. Well, we'll see if my response corresponds to your anticipation of my
Okay.
response. My sense is that astrobiology, say for instance, in the categories that I suggested, something like the alien or measure, as ways, as central categories for a kind of explication of what what is going on in the thinking that's involved in astrobiology. Should any of those categories or their explication prove to be either empirically or socially unacceptable for publicly reasoned ways, then they're certainly falsifiable. If, for instance, the notion of alien as an aspect of the kind of thinking that generates astrobiological thinking is demonstrated to be incorrect, that is not a structure of human consciousness, then it would be very clear that that ought not to be a category, and thus that is falsifiable as a way of trying to explicate what's going on in the dynamics of astrobiological thinking as a scientific thinking. So my argument in this is that in many ways, most sciences are, propel themselves forward in some ways by suggesting that what you see in front of you may not be the way things are. And that to investigate that means that you suggest a hypothesis in some reasonable form to be able to advance that move into a better understanding of why you would say what's in front of you is not exactly happening the way it looks like to you. All right. The pen is falling. And indeed, I wouldn't think that there is some relationship between space-time and the falling of the pen as a normal, everyday activity. I would simply say, pick up the pen. Otherwise, somebody's going to step on it. But when I raise the question about why it is that that occurs, then I need to suspend what my normal everyday propositions are and begin to investigate in that area of suspension other ways of trying to understand that it is in front of me. The pen fell. And so to that extent, if my suspension, if what I am doing as a interpretive category, in this case, for instance, space-time with gravity, or what I'm doing with, say, astrobiology, that I can have non-aqueous mediums for supporting life, say methane, prove to be true or not true, then that's where the areas of falsifiability come in. And basically, the fundamental thing that I'm saying here in terms of, quote, the theology of all of this, is that indeed astrobiology, as well as astrophysics and chemistry and biology and any of what we consider to be the normal modern empirical sciences, take place inside of social contexts. Society supports all of those endeavors, and it supports them by assumptions about what is reliable knowledge. That good, reliable knowledge depends upon testing, empirical investigation, hypothesis, suspension of hypothesis, correction, rather than saying, oh, a circle is a perfect form, and so all planetary orbits need to be circular. As a function of a natural philosophical Aristotelian approach to a science. So long answer, I guess now.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it's falsifiable.
So much of what we do in science is in the small. It's people might say the small ball, right? We make these tiny advances, and if you look at what people who refer themselves as astrobiologists actually do, the papers they publish, the experiments they run, the measurements they make, they are so far away at the moment from the big picture, and these very much larger questions that I suppose it's not surprising that particularly for those of us who don't even on a day-to-day basis think about astrobiology. I think, we think more about uh, uh, variable stars or astrochemistry, composition of Jovian planet atmospheres, our own little incremental things. That I guess it's not surprising that the folks like me wouldn't have spent a lot of time thinking about the big picture things. I guess one thing that comes to mind is the difficulties of thinking outside the box in so many ways. There's this wonderful little book called Flatland,
Yeah.
which was originally a book, and then it became a very cute little short movie narrated by Dudley Moore, and of course the I would show that to cosmology students to talk about how it's difficult to understand realities beyond 3 dimension for any of us mortals, really. We can do the mathematics, but getting a gestalt of it is rather difficult. And I guess, but it also tells a story about how, or gives us a way of understanding how it's so hard for us to think outside of our own experiences. When it comes to extraterrestrial life astrobiology, I'm thinking of the wonderful Black Cloud, the wonderful book by Fred Hoyle, which had life in the form of a molecular cloud rather than anything solid, or fluid. I guess I'm curious as to whether or not you think the adding a theological understanding or awareness, maybe, to the education of those folks who are going to go on and do the astrobiology in the small will help.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And there's several questions inside of what you said. One is the issue of moving from mathematics to images. I mean, in one way, theologians are, if I look at the contemporary structure of theological education right now, no theologian needs to take a mathematics course, which is just absurd. As if that isn't a significant way of understanding what it is our realities are. So, very beginning to exclude certain kinds of languages from questions of larger human meaning, we're just in the middle of those kinds of things, is to me a real fault in the structure of the language, or in the structure of education, the kinds of education that we do ourselves. In the same way, and this an interesting example of this, I was at a conference at Louvain-la-Neuve in Belgium, and they have a significant robotics institute at Louvain. And we had this dialogue that was going on with robotics people there, and they were explaining 4 levels of robotics that they were involved in. And the highest level of robotics had to do with artificial intelligence and judgment making, particularly in fields like combat, where they were envisioning and designing robots that would substitute on a battlefield for individuals making decisions about what life is and what life isn't, and who should live and who shouldn't live. And the question was raised was, well, is there any ethical concern inside of that? And the response was no, there's no ethical concern. This is a project in which we are presented with a problem, and as engineers, I design in relationship to a solution to that problem. So just as much as I think theological education minus any course in math, as well as a science education that systematically segments itself from the society in which it is itself practicing its science, creates fundamental problems in terms of ultimately the kinds of questions and meaning that we seek for ourselves.
I'd love to sign on to teaching astrophysics to a group of theologians.
Yeah.
That sounds like be a gas.
I'd love to teach a course with you on this.
Sounds good to me. We do have quite a few questions. So I'm going to start with Paul Carr, who asks, doesn't Tillich's God as the ground of all being make sense cosmically as well as terrestrially? And how does that integrate with the gap that you started with?
It does. It does. And clearly there's, for those who are theologians out there are clearly footnotes in this entire presentation to Tillich and to Schleiermacher. It's very clear. And it's also very clear in terms of the philosophical heritage inside of this. There's a lot that's going on with Kant and the take-up of Kant in phenomenological philosophy in a variety of ways. I averred to that in kind of various ways that I know are tokens of larger areas of thought that are going on. I think Tillich's project is an ontological project, and my project, insofar as it wants to remain phenomenological, that is, it is viewing, my concern is to view as an inescapable initial step in trying to interface, quote, traditional theologies with astrobiology, is not in an ontology or a metaphysics of being, but rather in consciousness and in language. And so my turn here is to suggest that the language that Tillich is using, ground of all being or ultimate concern, or things that are typically associated with a kind of Tillichian perspective, and the issue of a kind of, quote, consciousness that you find inside of Schleiermacher's notion of absolute dependence as critical for understanding any kind of a doctrine inside of a Christian context. I'm agreeing with that, but not wanting to go. And this is where I think my own thinking, again, for those who are interested in this area, informed by the Heideggerian, they turn hesitant to an ontotheology. I don't want to go in the direction of Marion so much. I think that's too quick, but I do think that, yes, there's clearly Tillichian and Schleiermachian echoes there.
Okay, sticking with questions about the gap between there is and we are. An anonymous attendee asks, can you speak about personal individuating and cosmic individuating as regards thinking? And they also said, great presentation. I'll be honest, I don't understand the question, but hope you do.
Yeah. Just give me those two terms again, and I'll try and see.
Personal individuating and cosmic individuating
Okay,
as regards thinking.
okay. Let me put a spin on that to see if I've got the question correct. So say, for instance, for Kierkegaard, truth is subjective in the sense of not being idiosyncratic, but that what I understand to be true involves me being involved in the situation. And in that sense, it is a personal investment inside of a reality. That may be understood, not necessarily, but it may be understood differently than saying what is true about gravitation is that it is best explained by a cosmic phenomenon of warping of space-time. So there's a distinction there between a kind of personal identification and a cosmic identification. And in that sense, what I'm talking about in terms of the we are and the it is maps a bit onto that. And why I want to say that the God notion is a place in between this, so that it is neither it's neither I nor is it, but whatever happens inside of the space that language opens up for the recognition of the fact that consciousness allows for self-awareness as well as cosmic awareness, provides for the possibility of trying to understand that kind of a place, a space in there. And that's what I'm, suggesting is theological. I hope that gets at the issue.
I hope so too. I think so. F. Brian Pickett asks, thanks, John. Interesting observations and proposition. I wonder if the combinations we discuss in Jesuit pedagogy, emphasizing reflection as we do science, might be an interesting method for a practice of astrobiological theology. Let me read that again because I got the emphasis a little weird. He's
Oh, I
wondering
know Brian, yes. Brian's on faculty at Loyola and was actually a co-director or a reader on CJ's dissertation.
Cool.
So on biological temporality. So we're providing an advertisement for going to CJ's work on biological temporality, genetic temporality.
He's asking if emphasizing reflection as we do science might be an interesting or good method for a practice of astrobiological theology.
I think yes. And the short answer, of course, is yes. The more nuanced answer is I'm afraid at times that Jesuit thinking immediately kind of brings in a kind of set of Christian symbols and may, at least to my mind, do that too quickly. Not that it might not, adequately be done or appropriately or informatively or any number of adjectives as we go along. But my move in probably Brian's question is to accent the reflective and to background the Jesuit.
Okay. Carlton, who I think you also probably know, is grateful for an intriguing, thought-provoking presentation. And he's intrigued by the gap that you set as the site for generative thought. And he's asking if you can speak more about that gap, please. Specifically, how does this gap impact reason-based operations of analysis and interpretation? How might the gap relate to the differentiation between cataphatic claims and the apophatic excess? These are not terms that are familiar to me. Hopefully you're nodding. There's more, but I'll let you go on those for now.
Okay, and again, that's a big question. So part of the first part in responding to that question, I'd go after the consciousness side of this and suspend for a moment the discussion of cataphatic and apophatic, and I'll explain those terms in a moment. But for the consciousness side of things, basic phenomenological perspective on human consciousness wants to suggest that the world that we live in is made up of the interaction between the way that, I suppose in modern terms, a long string of evolution has developed the way that we perceive and understand our world, as well as that world itself. And so the phenomenon exists in some combination of the I and what is not I. And in that sense, say, for instance, I'm very good in my very terrestrial life of perceiving certain wavelengths of electromagnetic energy as light. That same electromagnetic energy I'm not able to perceive as radio waves unless I have a radio. And in that sense, it's invisible to me and doesn't become invisible to me, nor was it visible to Aristotle or Thomas, because they simply did not live in that kind of a world, even though the electromagnetic waves were there. It's just that the phenomenon of their world didn't recognize that kind of thing.
I have
Now,
heard claims made about recognition of the color blue by ancient people.
yes,
Similar.
yeah, and there's all kinds of very interesting ways of, phenomenologically and optically making that true. That is, how different colors become obvious against different kinds of backgrounds or against different kinds of motions. That's another thing to get into. Let me just hit, because there may be other questions, the cataphatic and apophatic thing. The terms are kind of common in theology, and oftentimes they distinguish the notion between a type of theology that can say something about God that refers to God. God is all powerful, or God is all knowing, or God is creator. Those are all cataphatic statements. They are statements in which there's a presumption that the language that you're using in some specifiable way refers to whatever it is this notion of God is. Now, the questions of reference and how that works get into analogy and all different kinds of things. An apophatic position typically suggests that the best that we can say about God is God is not. God is not a being. God is not a thing. God is not that. And so there's a sense that the notness is the priority, which may open onto something that is beyond a kind of language. But the only way that you can get to that is through the not first. Right?
So these terms have the same roots as cations and anions in the science world.
Right. I mean,
it's all making sense now.
Yeah, we're going back to Greek here.
So how does that relate to the gap?
Well, to the gap, because I mean, the one of the ways that somebody could understand my thinking is that basically what I am suggesting is that the it is apophatic. That is, you'll never be able to say what the totality is because of the finitude and limits of our own consciousness. So you're always ultimately going to be caught in a kind of apophatic world. And my position inside of this is that, don't know, maybe, but to make that assumption is ultimately to make a kind of ontological and metaphysical claim, which I'm unwilling to make at this point, not because it might not be made, but because I think it's premature. In the same way that my sense is certain theological claims could be made. I just think that, assuming there's a wonderful book that came out recently. It's called 42 Reasons to Hate the Universe and One Reason Not to. And the 42 reasons go through a very interesting, detailed way of how the universe is out to get you. That it is fundamentally hospitable, that it's poisonous, that it will and does kill you. And so there is the sense in which religious language that rushes quickly to love and hope and comfort and these kinds of things in a way that I think astrobiology doesn't. It doesn't allow you to say, well, of course there's life elsewhere. It allows you to say, how do we go about asking that kind of a question? And that, I think, is the hesitancy that one of the things that theology might learn from astrobiology.
Very interesting. Thank you. We only have a few minutes left, and we may not get to all of the questions. But here's one from John McGinnis, who asks, what are the implications if we encounter non-human intelligences? How would we recognize them as intelligent, which is, a core astrobiological question. But then what theology would they have? How would we deal with it? If they're not fallen in the Christian sense, how would they be able to relate to such terrestrial theological perspectives as the concept of redemption, for example, on which Christianity is founded? Would these unfallen and hence not redemption-seeking creatures even want to establish any kind of relationship with humanity as we know it, or would they just try to avoid us completely?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Again, that's a wonderful speculative question, which I think does less by achieving an answer than it does by allowing us to recognize what makes us ask that question. It comes back as a kind of mirror to show us that, one, theology and the kind of theology that we're used to is hardwired into an understanding of our humanity, understanding of what it is that we think we are, either fallen, or to use that language, or sinful, or good, or finite, or frail, or in need of consolation, or those kinds of beings that can hope. I have a dog by the name of Squeaky. And basically, I don't think Squeaky hopes in the way that we do. He may want a treat. He may hope that the food dish is filled in some unusual way. But the idea that we would hope beyond our own frailty, hope beyond our own, say, quote, fallenness, or capacity to do absolutely horrific things and do those things knowingly, that I don't see, present. And so my quick response to that question would be to say, let's look at how we relate to animal species other than us in order to understand, at least analogously, how we might relate to extraterrestrial species who are intelligent, if that ever happens, all right, in ways which might be compatible to us. So,
Or maybe less compatible because we don't treat animals very well.
right, yeah, exactly, exactly. I mean, how it is that a variety of life forms perceive time. We're all concerned here in the Midwest right now about what's going to happen with the 7-year cycle of cicadas, right? They perceive time in a radically different way than we perceive time, all right? Maybe we're not even talking about the same thing, but it's that kind of interaction that I think provides a better analogy for what might be in terms of interaction with other species than just staying with ourselves.
Very interesting. Thank you. This may cause us to run over a little bit, but there's one more question I want to get in here from Hans Verbakken, who really is asking you to put the rubber onto the road. There's more to it, but he ends with, well, he says, I'm still struggling to grasp a very specific theological question in this context. Can you imagine for us a hypothetical dissertation title or two from a theologian working in the field of astrobiology sometime in the future? What does it look like in terms of a dissertation?
Well, I could conceive of multiple topics actually inside of this. The way that I phrased it in the presentation was what gives life to astrobiological thinking? What gives life to thinking about life? And what categories might that take to be able to respond to that kind of a question? That I don't think is radically dissimilar to the way contemporary theology talks about the notion of a God as a living God or a God who gives life, choose life over death, as a kind of maxim that you find inside of Hebrew scriptures. So the topic of life, specified by an articulation of what is it that gives life to the astrobiological quest, I think would be a topic that would constitute something like the field for a dissertation inside of astrobiological theology, as opposed to astrotheology. And I tried to make that distinction at least somewhat inside of the presentation. But I think the more typical way in doing theological thinking about the sciences is to say, how is it that we can take a category from a religious tradition and have it informed by or tweaked or expanded by contemporary sciences, whether they're physics, astrophysics, astrobiology, chemistry, whatever. And the crux of my argument in this is that it does not allow for the discipline itself to suggest itself as responding, being able to respond to its own question about what gives life to its own inquiry. And that's where I think the difference between the it is and the we are exists.
Well, thank you. This has been very interesting and enlightening, and I appreciate you taking the time to make the presentation and answer the questions. And so gratitude from me and from IRAS as a whole, and also to Robert Boyle, our respondent this evening.